Hello, everyone, and welcome to City Lights Live, the virtual iteration of the City Lights events calendar. I'm your host, Peter Maravellis, and this afternoon we are delighted to welcome back our friends at Wave Books, purveyors of finely produced editions of poetry and prose. Over the years, they have consistently produced a body of work that places them at the forefront of indie publishing. We are delighted to be hosting today two remarkable poets that share the imprint. We are delighted to have back in the house Lisa Jarnot, celebrating this time an autobiographical work that takes the form of essays, aptly titled 4 Essays. We're also delighted to be hosting for the first time Chris Nealon, celebrating his fifth collection of poetry titled All About You. Before we begin, I would like to take a moment to acknowledge that we are beaming to you from the unceded ancestral homelands of the Ohlone peoples. As is customary at the outset of each event, I would like to offer our respect to those who came before us as stewards of the land. Lisa Jarnot was born in Buffalo, New York, and educated at SUNY Buffalo. She is the author of several collections of poetry, including Some Other Kind of Mission, Ring of Fire, and A Princess Magic Presto Spell, amongst other fabulous titles. City Lights had the great pleasure of publishing her collection Joie de Vivre, which was number 9 in our Pocket Poet series. I'm sorry, not our Pocket Poet series, our Spotlight series, I should say, which is edited by Garrett Caples. She co-edited an anthology of new American poets, and her biography of San Francisco poet Robert Duncan, the Ambassador from Venus, was published by the University of California Press. She has been a visiting professor at Naropa University, Brooklyn College, and the University of Colorado Boulder. Lisa is also a minister at Safe Haven United Church of Christ, and she makes her home in Jackson Heights, Queens. Chris Nealon is John Dewey Professor of English at Johns Hopkins University. He is the author of The Shore, also published by Wave Books, The Joyous Age, published by Black Square Editions, and Heteronomy, as well as 3 books of literary criticism. He makes his home in Washington, D.C. So join us now in welcoming to our Pacific Host Lunchtime Reading, Lisa Jarnot and Chris Nealon. Welcome to City Lights.
Good afternoon. I'm glad to be here. Thank you, Peter. I was going to read poems, but then Peter and Chris said no, you should read from the new Wave piece. So I'm gonna read part of this piece called Epistle to the Summer Writing Program on the Metaphysics of Deep Gossip, which is kind of a little bit more about New York and the New York School. I'm gonna just read until I get to like 18 minutes, and then wherever we are, then it'll be a cliffhanger. And I'll read the rest of it at some other reading in some other dimension. So I want to tell you a story about the first summer that I lived in New York City, which is a story that begins at the beginning of June in 1994, when I moved to New York. Sorry, I already lost my place. I want to tell you a story about the first summer that I lived in New York City, which is a story that begins at the beginning of June in 1994, when I moved into a studio apartment on East 6th Street between Avenue A and Avenue B on the north side of the street, a half block from the Sidewalk Cafe, where they had tables outside where you could drink tea and eat English muffins. And it was also the summer of the O.J. Simpson white Bronco car chase, which I watched on TV with my friend Dave, who also moved to New York that summer and lived with me in the studio apartment on East 6th Street between Avenue A and Avenue B. And I want to propose that it was a really hot and humid summer, or at least that's how I remember it now, that there was a weird, funky stench that I thought was cat pee, but it was really the tree of heaven shoots growing in the little patches of green between the buildings, like in the book A Tree Grows in Brooklyn, which I've never read. And the garden level studio apartment was where Dave and I watched the O.J. Simpson white Bronco car chase on the TV, and where there were a few pieces of furniture, including a table and a refrigerator and a bed and probably a couple of chairs. And Dave slept in the bed and I slept on the floor, because we had made a deal that the first one who got a job could sleep in the bed. And he got a job first working as a printer down in Soho for his friend Henry's father, which meant he had the right to the bed. And I got a job second with the help of the dancer Sally Silvers, whose dancing I loved because she reminded me of Charlie Chaplin. But what I really remember is that the shower there in that apartment was a dingy pink color because it was also the summer of something on the news that they were calling the flesh-eating virus. So every time I got in the shower and I noticed a scratch or a mosquito bite, I thought I had the flesh-eating virus and that I was going to die. And also, one more detail is that when I slept on the pile of blankets on the linoleum floor, which was my bed, I was surrounded by roach families waving their antennae from the nooks and crannies of the baseboards with the cat pee smell of the tree of heaven trees coming from the ground level windows that looked out over not much except the back of another building. And this all felt like something new, which is to say that it was disorienting to be in New York City, which seemed really exotic to me. And also to my friend Dave, because we were from Buffalo, where you have to work very hard to have something exciting happen on a summer afternoon. But in New York, it seemed like something exciting was happening every day, every second of the day. And even the subways and bodegas were open all night. And the Chinese food restaurants also, like the one on Avenue C and 9th Street, where I preferred the roast pork and vegetables on rice, which was downstairs from the building where we found out through the grapevine that a criminally insane cannibal had eaten his girlfriend in 1989. And 2 blocks away from the studio apartment shared by me and Dave and the Roaches was Bernadette Mayer's apartment on East 4th Street that she shared with Phil, who was her boyfriend, and Marie and Sophie and Max, who were her children, and also with a lot of roaches, but with no other pets. And the point is that I moved to New York City to have this experience, to live down the street from Bernadette, but not necessarily to live near cannibals or roaches, because all I ever wanted to do was to listen to Bernadette talk. I want to tell you why all I ever wanted to do was to listen to Bernadette talk, which was because she had a way of saying things that at first seemed like they were mundane, but they were always transcendent. And this included the way she asked questions that made you think more deeply about life. Like if you really had a crush on someone, she would ask, "Is he your mother or your father?" So on almost every night after I spent the day in bed, which was a pile of blankets on the floor, reading the Village Voice want ads because I was kind of looking for a job, I would walk the 2 blocks down Avenue A, past the Key Food supermarket and the couple of remaining tiny Polish storefronts where you could get good rye bread and dried apricots wrapped in butcher block paper. And I would ride the elevator to the 9th floor in Bernadette's building, which is where Bernadette's apartment was, to hang out with her and Phil and sometimes the kids, but usually the kids were busy doing kid things, like exploring the subway tunnels to see who was living down there. I swear to God. And one time, Max came home with an orange and green water pistol that was really more the size of a machine gun, and he was spraying us all with water. And this was often how it was at Bernadette's around the big wooden table in the dining room, which was covered with stacks of papers, of poems, and kids' homework, and Bernadette's freelance writing work, and what I am saying is that it was never boring, which made other people want to come there too. Sometimes my friend Dave, and sometimes Lainey Brown, who lived on East 7th Street with her cat Smokey, and sometimes Kevin Davies, who lived on Allen Street in an apartment building that had all Chinese residents except for him, who was a Canadian, because the previous resident of Kevin's apartment had killed himself, and Kevin was pretty sure that now they only rented that particular apartment to Canadians. And I should say right now that there were other important places to go to in the neighborhood, which were Kim's Video on Avenue A, where a 2-day movie rental was $2. And it must have been VHS tapes back then. And there was also Habib's falafel stand, where guys played impromptu jazz out on the sidewalk, including Tony Garnier from Bob Dylan's band. So I like to stop by there just in case. And also the pizza place on the southwest corner of Tompkins Square Park that was later replaced by something more fancy, like maybe a French restaurant. But while it was still a pizza place, the pizza was $1.25 a slice. And also, of course, there was St. Mark's Church, where I'm pretty sure I saw John Ashbery read that summer. And there was Gem Spa, where I had my first egg cream, which I was surprised to find out did not have eggs in it. And just to review the math, it was true that on any given day on the Lower East Side, for $3.25, there was a full evening of food and entertainment, which was a slice of pizza and a movie from Kim's Video, unless you wanted to add an egg cream or a beer or a martini at the Tile Bar, which is what Kevin Davies and I especially liked to do that summer. And one more thing about the cheap entertainment that I should point out right now that I decided I wanted to watch all of Fellini's movies that summer. And I'm not sure why, except that they were dark and light and ecstatic and depressing at the same time. Especially like the scene on the beach in La Dolce Vita, where the sea monster is looking up with its dead eye at all the sexy Italians who really don't care about it very much. But of course, it's also the case that there was something about the reckless love of Marcello Mastroianni that felt connected to the reckless love I had for and got from New York City. And also, that reminded me of the way poets could be reckless and compelling and kind of prickly, like Stephen Rotifer, for example, who turned out to like European movies too, especially the French ones where people had oral sex. And in fact, I would say that moving to New York kind of had that about it, a mix of the good life and the new life, like a cross between a Fellini movie and a Dante book, as in when Dante says of love, "Here is a God stronger than I, who shall come to rule over me." And that is what I was thinking about when I thought of New York when I first lived there, that it was a God stronger than I, especially on the block between 7th and 8th and B and C, where Laney lived with Smokey the cat. And across the street was the Squatters building, where Brad Will had his pirate radio show. And there were chickens and even a rooster on that block that you could hear all the way over to St. Bridget's Church, where a couple of years later we would all go to Elio Schneeman's funeral. And there was a reception afterward in the basement that was very sad. And that was one of the many deaths around then, around the time that the Lower East Side was about to be gentrified, but it wasn't yet gentrified. Because just for a moment, for example, on Avenue C, you could buy a live pigeon out of a box for dinner, which reminds me about how later, when I moved to Sunnyside, that said that her high school boyfriend, Bob Viscusi, was from Sunnyside, and that his mother used to shoot pigeons from her fire escape window for dinner. And I liked that story because it said something about the steady self-determination of poets and immigrants. But I wondered where Bob Viscusi's mother got a shotgun from. And just with all of this, you can see the sheer amount of mental processing it took to live in New York City, not to mention the fact of the noise of the air conditioners and the air shafts, and the fact that there was actually a movie being shot at night outside our window with a big spotlight on a crane. And also once someone died in the building next door, and we watched the little dented, rusty coroner's van take the body away in a dark blue plastic body bag. And all of that made me realize that as much as I loved New York, I was also getting a little bit agoraphobic, which is something I shared with Kevin Davies, who lived on Allen Street, and with Bernadette, who lived on East 4th Street. So Kevin suggested I take Valium, and Bernadette suggested I see Dr. Phil, who was her anthroposophical doctor, whose office was on the Upper East Side, and who was really old and German. And when I asked him what was wrong with me, he said that it was his opinion that when I woke up in the morning, my soul didn't want to come back into my body from the astral plane because I frankly had too much going on. And so he gave me an acupuncture treatment, which I remember because he accidentally left some of the needles in my head like tiny horns. And he also gave me an injection of something in a hypodermic needle. And I asked him, "What is that?" And he said, "It's Aurum," which I later found out was gold dust, which didn't work as well as the Valium I got when I eventually went to the emergency room at St. Vincent's and I said I thought I was having a heart attack. But after I saw Dr. Phil, I was really disturbed about my soul's intention not to live in my body. So I went to the New York Public Library on Fifth Avenue with the statues of the lions on the steps, and I sat in the big wooden echoing reading room reading rare books by Rudolf Steiner, which told me some things about orders of angels on the astral plane, but I don't remember getting a lot of insights about what was really wrong with me. And all of this reminds me of how much can happen in one day in New York City, which is why the phrase ecstatic connectedness and also the word entanglement are in my mind right at this very moment. Because I think it's accurate to say that New York for me is all about an ecstatic, connected entanglement that began for me through my friendship with Bernadette Mayer on the Lower East Side in the hot and humid summer of 1994, when O.J. Simpson was on the run in his white Ford Bronco, and people like me, who were agoraphobic hypochondriacs, were worried about catching the flesh-eating virus. And it's funny to think how such a confluence of things in a dirty city like New York could be the inspiration for things that look like pastoral odes from the English countryside. But this is what happened for me when I started writing poems in New York. And they became praise poems, like Dante says, for the city that came to rule over me. Because it was so strange and reckless, like if a city was Marcello Mastroianni or Stephen Rotifer. So when I wrote, O life force of supernalness of world, and ye white Antarctic birds, and poem beginning with a line by Frank Lima, and O razorback clams, those were all written around 1995 or 1996 when New York and I were still in our honeymoon phase. And this is what it sounds like to be on a honeymoon with a strange and reckless city. This is a poem called Ye White Antarctic Birds, which is a poem that I wrote after going to see a show of Joe Brainerd's collages with Anselm Berrigan at Tibor Nanaj Gallery in Midtown, which was not long after Joe Brainerd died, which I also remember because there was a gigantic thunderstorm that swept over the city that afternoon. And I always think of Joe ascending to heaven up the rainbow that I saw on East 10th Street after that. Ye white Antarctic birds of upper 57th Street, you gallery of white Antarctic birds, you street with white Antarctic birds and cabs and white Antarctic birds, you street, ye and you the street and birds I walk upon, the gallery of streets and birds and longings, you the birds Antarctic of the conversations and the bank machines, you the ATM of longing, the longing for the ATM machines, you the lover of banks and me and birds and others too and cabs, and you the cabs and you the subtle longing birds and me, and you the conversations yet Antarctic and soup and teeming white Antarctic birds, and you the books and phones and ATMs, the bank machines Antarctic, and you the banks and cabs, and him the one I love, and those who love me not, and all Antarctic longings, and all the birds and cabs, and also on the street Antarctic of this longing. And probably what I've been holding onto in my mind since I started writing this letter is that it is appropriate for me to be called a New York school poet, which is not to disavow other things like the Black Mountain School or the Beats, but to say that the poems I write, which are recognizable as poems by Lisa Jarnot, are New York school poems in the way that they move. For example, here's the first New York school poem I ever wrote, which is called Dictionary, because of the game where you find an obscure word in the dictionary and everyone writes a fake definition for it. And then you try to find out which definition is real and which are the fake ones. And you get points for faking people out. And this is definitely a poem I wrote for Bernadette, but I never wrote for Bernadette on it. I just knew it was for her. Like I later wrote Age of the Velocipede. When I wrote Age of the Velocipede, I never wrote for Anne Waldman on it, but I knew it was for Anne because it began with a line she wrote to me in the first postcard she ever sent to me, which I kept on my desk, which opened with the line, "You are not a wounded animal." But to go back to the poem called Dictionary, it sounds like this. As a small South American squirrel, inhabiting mostly mountainous regions, would feed on lizards halfway between the poles of the tropics. I, too, would fall heartbreaked in the settlement of feuds or the fields of Kentucky, when the moss grows high between the perennials and disordered mimics weep. These dainty, fastidious, gestating mammals break for leavened bread and sup between the rows of trees, lifting like friars some heavy books in sunlight's morning windows, where the mollusks row in Sion's quadragesimal phyla. I'm going to stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Lisa. That was really beautiful. It made me think about the summer of 1994, which was the summer I switched coasts for a little while. So a big one for me, though I was not among the legends like you were. It was just gorgeous. I'm going to read a really short poem, like a little one-page poem, and then a slightly longer poem. And the longer poem is the first poem in this book called All About You, and this other piece is newer. And this is called The Right to Exist. I've been trying to figure out which countries have the right to exist, since people have been asking. The United States does not have a right to exist. I checked. Canada, nope. Britain, France, Germany, Japan, the Ming Dynasty, the Ottoman Empire, all the people whose nations and affiliations were divvied up along the lines most profitable for their colonizers. They all have a right to exist, every single person, but not their countries. Wait, every single person? Who stands there looking at the people around them one by one and going, oh, cool, you have the right to exist. Yep, yep, check, check, check. A sociopath, that's who. The universal is not a number, and it doesn't have a certificate. I think we could do an amazing job of living together, given the chance. What would be a good name for the way of living where we became universal because we could afford not to be individuals all the time? Hint, we wouldn't toil like this. What's the name of the system that prevents us from giving it a shot? I'm not going to say, because they're checking all our syllabi now. But I trust you, and I think you know. This book is coming out, I think, in a couple of weeks. And I'm so delighted that I got to work with the folks at Wave to bring it out. It's got, the book as a whole has a little epigraph from the poet George Stanley, from a poem that he wrote about paradise. And it's not quite the epigraph for the poem itself, but the poem itself is the first poem in the book. So I'm just going to read this quick little epigraph. Whatever this place is that we will not admit to each other, we have discovered is all there is. And this poem is called I'm In. Half already living in the new way, half attached to disregarded promises. We seem to have gotten lost on the way to the club. I blame Donald. He and Mike got me into this. Making our way down the middle of an unlit street through a landscape, partly city, partly open plain. Late night party sounds from living rooms, empty lots and uncapped sewers. It's hard to tell what's occupied and what's abandoned. Adam loops around us on his bike, saying just a couple more blocks. Then, look out, dead cat. It's undecayed, but plastered to a hump in the grass. Its tail curls pointedly toward an open hole. We peer down into it, but Carrie tugs my sleeve and murmurs, live dog? pit bull watching from the porch, no leash, no gate. I startle, but he smiles. Later at the bar, he says, yeah, I work in the tenderloin. I'm always on the watch for whether things are dead or alive. California seems so far away. Absently, he snaps a button on his cowboy shirt. Then he takes a candy wrapper out of his pocket and says, we should use this, nodding at the darkened door. It's a ticket. Gold foil? I shine my phone light on it. Tiny iridescent lines of text flash out. He lets another button go and I'm in. This is the work of memory. When you are about to die, go down to the well-built house of Hades. There is a spring on the right side, and standing by it, a white cypress. Do not even go near that spring. The guards will ask you what you are seeking in the darkness. Say, I am a child of earth and starry sky. I am parched with thirst and I am dying. Please grant to give me water from the lake. The poem about the body and the poem above the body. The way you're in one place and the way you're on a journey. Or maybe I'm just someone who runs errands. Before I traveled to New Orleans, I came back home to Western New York State, land of the dead. Sorry, Lisa. Watery coffee in the cup holder. Funeral suit in the trunk. Is it a road trip if you're alone? Chargers and Mustangs. Chargers and Mustangs. Halfway there and going 85, you're really in the headspace. That guy from Kentucky wants to mess with you, but don't take the bait. His license plate reads all nuts. Starting out from Washington was slow. I caught the scent of marshland in a tiny paradise near BWI. But paradise for what? A doe. You see one flash behind the trees, all that muscle built from chopping leaves. And at the marsh's center, nowhere you could step. You'd have to melt or somersault into some other form. Traffic picks up, and bam, it's Pennsylvania. Back at the bar, we've made it to the other side. Yeji's singing Rain Girl. The documentarians are draped on couches and snuggling in love seats. They don't seem to hang out with the feature people. There's a lot of pirates in here and medieval whites and bon vivants in stripper costumes. Wait, how do you dress like a... PJ and I agree that jumpsuits are hot, but why? Talina, body length zippers, hello? The couches are velvet and the walls deep red. Donald and I start comparing notes on that Twin Peaks reboot. I was grossed out by the whole time loop thing at the end. It just felt like Lynch not owning up to his Manichaeism. And haven't we reached peak Dead Girl? Sorry. Criticism creeping into poetry. What does Vivaldo tell Ida in Another Country? I'm just a fucked up group of people. I'm a two-part person, writing out of incompatible moods. It's planning to rock now. With passerine agility, the living and the dead gavotte from room to room. I feel low to the ground, but peopled. The disaster has already happened, and everyone knows it will come again. I turn to Adam and I ask him, so do you like it here? He grins at me and says, it's the best place on earth. God. Church. I grew up in this sanctuary, straining to hear a sound. It was Vatican II, but Operation Rescue. When my dad couldn't drive anymore, my mother would take us to Burger King for an hour and make up a homily afterward. But I loved my Uncle Art, and I'm glad to have something to offer. Brothers and sisters, it begins. We know that if our earthly dwelling, the tent, should be destroyed, we have another building, a dwelling not made with hands. Paul moved around a lot. On Google Maps, it looks like it would take you 18 hours to get from Corinth to Ephesus. This route has tolls, includes a ferry ride. Now I feel bad that I edited his letter. Let me put the God back in. Looking down at the assembled, I can see the front door open. To see the light is almost to walk down the aisle. I could so easily have been that priest after services on some broad lawn in a summer breeze, thinking with satisfaction how the Lord made the birches. But I'm on the road back home. It's not the flooding, is it? Or the fires. It's not the mass extinction. It's what kind of struggle will this be? And what will we become? What I mean is, will the terminal pressure on the way the rich make us make value pit us all against each other? Also, will we mutate fast enough? The Goldilocks in me is always trying to imagine a remediated future where everything is just the right price. The Christian wears me down by always asking me to poke through the material world. I've driven myself half crazy thinking I can sift out what's the redemptive part and what's the hell. But not tonight. Outside, through the door, behind the door, a zombie is buying barbecue for 20 girls in firefighter costumes. Between two DJ sets, you can hear the karaoke down the street. It's like there's no pure silence. My fears are talking smack about my dreams, but I'm not listening. I have been to lots of parties in expensive capitals and God-forsaken little towns. I have found myself at the impossible point where the cyclone meets the countercyclone. Have you ever had that feeling where there's just about no difference between being ready to dance and ready to go to the wall? When those chords break through, I know that I am not a two-part person, and neither are you. You are something unforeseeable, something that sings. Oh, my friends, it's going down, and we may not survive. But liberation beckons in all things. Thanks, everyone.
I think I see Garrett hiding behind like a couch. Garrett, is that you? He's been kind of like listening to the whole thing and going through someone's library. Don't know if he can hear us. That was fantastic. Thank you both. That was really great. Any
Can we unmute
let me
Chris?
see if I can get you unmuted there, Chris. Sorry, you got muted. Let me see if I can get you out of there. Yeah.
That's like the Zoom era's indication that the poet has read too long.
Yeah. Amazing reading, Chris.
Oh.
Really beautiful, beautiful poems.
Thank you, Lisa. Likewise. I apologize. My version of Zoom, that my most comfortable way of sitting is like this, but it constantly makes a bubble with a thumbs up in it because it thinks I'm trying to do this. Sorry.
That's magic. How did you do that?
It was disturbing at first because it made me seem like I was endorsing random shit, but I just sit here like this, and then after about 5 seconds, it's creepy because it's reading your body language. Let's see if you have the same edition.
I don't have, no.
Okay. Here's the crazy one.
Oh
Well, at least
man,
you
I'm
don't have
not.
like a cat face coming up or something, you
I don't know. Anyway, thank you both, Peter, for having us, and Lisa, that was wonderful.
Yeah, it's such a pleasure. Well, really appreciate you both gracing our virtual halls. And I want to thank Catherine over at Wave for all that she does. Once again, one of the premier publishers of poetry on the West Coast. I have posted links in the chat with which you may check out their website. Also posted links which you may use to purchase books directly from City Lights of both Lisa and Chris's work. Better yet, if you find yourselves in the hood, come on down, browse our stacks. We are one of the great browsing experiences of all time. We're located in San Francisco's historic North Beach district. We're open from 10 a.m. to 10 p.m. every day of the year. So pay us a visit. Today's event has been made possible by support from the City Lights Foundation, keeping me dutifully employed and continuing the legacy of our founder, the late Lawrence Ferlinghetti, through our public events, publishing program, and all our educational outreach, all dedicated to sustaining a vibrant community of readers, writers, and critical thinkers. So any last thoughts, Lisa, Chris?
I have a question for Chris. I'm really curious about, you mentioned George Stanley, but Jack Spicer. I mean, I know that there's a difference in the presentation and the use of the eye, but it feels very Spicerian to me in terms of the relationship to God, and yeah, it's really beautiful.
Oh, thank you. Yeah,
Tell me, yeah.
I don't know if I have anything really detailed to say about that, except that that's super perceptive of you, and that I feel like when I was most absorbed in Spicer, like really starting to try to understand why I love the poem so much, the two things that I remember thinking were super cool were like his willingness to, the famous thing about the Martians, like his willingness to imagine like something radically outside himself to just come on in. And then also like the way he was super into like versioning, like ringing changes on a thing, and sometimes I think that was part of his sense of magic too, like almost like shell games, like I loved his sense of poems as games, like almost like party games.
Yes, that makes sense. Yeah.
It's hard to imitate, but it's wonderful to read.
Yeah, but it's I'm instance of the work in a way that also in the humor of um there's a kind of almost nihilistic but also life-giving back and forth in those poems that reminds me of Spicer.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, I forgot to say something at the beginning of that second longer poem, which is that I was quoting from the text of this famous thing. It's called the Gold Lamella. I forget which island it was found on, but it's like these things that were put in the coffins of wealthy people as kind of like passports to the underworld. And I got like that is a very Spicerian thing too, just the whole bringing of an underworld into a poem. I have to say that the kind of like the thing I was enjoying most in your reading today was something about the way that the cosmic and the quotidian kept talking to each other, like actual people in actual rooms, and through the medium of Bernadette, who seemed like the pinhole through which they could begin to talk to each other. So your soul leaving your body and being reluctant to come back, but also like what you had for lunch. And you set that up through a friendship, but then it opens up onto a whole way of being world that I really love. That is that something that like I don't know, just feels like temperamentally innate to you, or that you I don't know
Yeah,
have polished and deepened over the years?
yeah, I mean the quotidian is just from being a suburban kid in America, I think, but it's such a New York school way of, like, I mean O'Hara and Schuyler, and just the ecstatic in the dailiness is,
Yeah,
yeah, I just always love that about the New York school.
yeah, same. It's a special thing. It's almost a theology, I think, or kind of like a
Yeah,
practical theology. Yeah.
yeah.
It's nice to get a chance to talk with you about this.
Yes, yes. And thank
Also,
you all for coming. Yeah.
yeah, I'll just say, Peter, too, that, I lived in the Bay for a long time, from 96 to 2008. And it was one of the great browsing experiences of all time to be able to go to your store in North Beach. So it's nice to be here virtually.
Oh, that means a great deal. Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you both. Love you both. Thank you so much for doing this. Thank you,
Bye,
Wendy.
everybody.
And thanks everybody for joining us for lunch. Be well.